Good morning, this is Miss Gonzalez. Today's lesson is all about modeling functions. We can use tables, we can use graphs, we can solve equations, and we can use technology. Usually the graphing tool of a calculator, or in this case we're going to use Desmos. So throughout this Nearpod lesson you will have a lot of mini videos and then questions to answer, and that will be your assignment for today. So this first video is going to be on analyzing tables. So in our pre-test you had a couple of examples of this already. I think for the most part you guys were all able to do this quite well. All right, so first we are looking at in what 5-year period did the actual MHW increase the most. So you would go through, and there's a couple of different ways you can do this, and you can just see here what is the difference, and that's about 0.25. And then from here again was 0.25, and then from here is about 35. 0.35, and it is hard to write very small. Let me see if I can make this a little bit bigger. Okay, then from here to here we have 50, and then from here to here we have 1. Here is less than 1, so now we're looking for a bigger chain than 1. Here is less than 1. Here is 45, so that's less than 1. Here's no change. Here to here, we missed this. That is about 0.90. This was no change. Here we might have the biggest change because this is going to be up to 0.10. So our biggest change is from 2005 until 2010. So this is just how we can use a table to describe certain trends over time. That is the first way to represent data, is to use tables, and a big skill to be able to do is to analyze these tables. All right, so the next question asks, in what year did a worker earning the MHW enjoy the greatest purchasing power? So here is another example of analyzing the table. You would go through and look at this table and find out when is the purchasing power in 2015 dollars worth the biggest. And that would be 1970, because 9.74 is the largest amount. Okay, and the last question here is saying a worker on minimum wage in 1980 was earning nearly twice as much as a worker on minimum wage in 1970, and yet there was a great pressure to raise the minimum wage again. Why? So here I would look back to history and see maybe if there was a big change in our economy back then, but usually constantly the cost of living is constantly increasing. And if the cost of living is constantly increasing, depending on how much it goes up yearly, then that is where we would need the minimum wage to be larger, so that way we can afford to buy things as the prices increase. For example, I think our minimum wage right now is either around $10 or $13. I can't remember last, but when I was in high school and that my minimum wage was around $7. Making $7 was a big deal. So that's a big difference per an hour to be making now than it was back then. So the pressure would definitely be coming from the cost of living. Okay. Okay, so in this example, we have two tables. So really, and I printed this from your book. In your book, you would have seen just this table as an example, okay? So the question would say, is the proportion of female officers increasing over time? So you would look at this table of 1.2 and ask yourself, well, how do I figure out the proportion? So proportion, rate, percentage, those are all meaning the same thing. So proportion and a rate are also a percentage depending on if you take your proportion, which is usually less than 1, and you multiply it by 100 and you'll get your percentage. And a rate is a proportion and a percentage depending on what you're talking about, because a rate is how something is changing over time. Okay, so in this case, if they're asking you is the proportion increasing, you have to figure out, well, what is that proportion in general? So here I would have to take female divided by total and multiply by 100. And that is where all of these numbers came from. So when they made table 1.3, they took the number of female officers divided by the total and multiplied it by 100. And then they're now asking you to look at this newly derived table and decide, is it constantly increasing over time? And by looking at this trend of data, even though from here to here it got a smaller change, it is consistently increasing all the way through. And you want to make sure you are looking at every single numbers, because on several problems, I think, in your textbook and on the SATs, you may see where it is increasing all the way until the end and then all of a sudden drops off. So if any point of the table decreases, even though that is not generally what is going on, you still need to talk about that when you are talking about the trend. You still need to pick that as your solution if there is a slight variance. So for example, I think the one in your pretest was increasing all the way until the end, and then it started to decrease again. So that needs to be in your description. That is not the case here. Here it is constantly increasing. So the answer to this question would be yes. It is constantly increasing over time. There is no decrease. If there was any other subtle changes you notice, the more detail you give, the better your answer is. So you always want to be as detailed as possible. The questions that you have to do that are on this video does talk about the rate. Now, and so after this example, it might be a little confusing, but I want you to read the title of the table. In the title of the table, it talks about rate. So if it is already giving you the rate in the table, it is also giving you the percent, okay? Rate and percent kind of mean the same thing depending on if it's out of 1 or out of 100. However it is still a percentage. So in the table, when you're given a rate, you can assume that's the percentage of change, and you don't have to make this additional table. Here, if you read the title of the table, it is just numbers in thousands. So this is 4,000 people. Sorry, trying to erase that. It is just thousands of people. So for this first one was 4,000, then it was 6,000, 5,000, 7,000, and so forth. Females in the worker office. So it's giving you an actual number. So this would not be considered a table based on rate. So if the question is asking you for proportion or percentage, you'd have to find it. But if in the title of the table it is saying the words rate, proportion, percent, you already have it and you don't have to make this additional table. Please let me know if you have any questions. You're going to try the next slide, and then there will be another mini video after that talking about another way to analyze tables.